Released in 2001, a full 9 years after Wolfenstein 3D, Return to Castle Wolfenstein was the fourth game and second first-person shooter with the Wolfenstein brand. This time developed by Grey Matter Interactive on a variant of the Quake 3 Arena engine, players are once again put into the boots of BJ Blazkowicz as he fights his way through Castle Wolfenstein, the German countryside, weapons facilities, research labs, and more to stop the Reich super soldier program, as well as the occult-tinged Project Resurrection. Described as a semi-retelling of Wolfenstein 3D, Grey Matter Interactive put a heavier emphasis on the occult aspects of the series introduced to Spear Destiny, with the plot following this project spearheaded by Heinrich Himmler trying to resurrect a Saxon prince. This last point has some interesting ties to reality, as those roughly familiar with the history of the Third Reich and its ties to the occult know that Himmler in real life genuinely did have an obsession with the paranormal and related subjects. Grey Matter Interactive was no stranger to first-person shooters either, being made up of former members of Zatrix Entertainment, who have a resume made up of the Redneck Rampage games, Kingpin, and the Quake 2 expansion, The Reckoning, to name a few. The latter of which more than likely put Grey Matter on id Software's radar. With this now established relationship with id Software, they were chosen to develop Return to Castle Wolfenstein. Grey Matter worked closely with id while making the game, giving them technical assistance, internal testing, programmers, and other employees. The engine in Return to Castle Wolfenstein is also worthy of note, as it was a mixture of both id Tech 3, the engine used for Quake 3 Arena, and early elements of the upcoming id Tech 4, which wouldn't see full realization until the release of Doom 3 in 2004. Return to Castle Wolfenstein is an action-heavy first-person shooter just as its predecessor, but with an added layer of production value and the additional design choices of other trailblazers of the genre, released between the time of 1992 and 2001. Aiming to be bigger and bolder than 3D, the weapon count jumps from the prior game's 4 to the latter's 16. The player starts off with a knife, which acts identical to the one from Wolfenstein 3D, and soon gets a Luger handgun like the prior game as well. The Luger is a standard 9mm pistol with a low-power semi-automatic fire, but has an added functionality of a silencer that mutes every shot. The second handgun is the 1911, which fires the 45 auto, can be dual-wielded Mark Lee style, and is significantly more powerful than the Luger. Moving on to the submachine guns, the MP40, also back from Wolfenstein 3D, automatic fires 9mm rounds like the Luger. Both it and the Thompson, the 45 auto equivalent, are fairly basic automatic weapons, with the latter being stronger and the former being faster with ammunition that's more plentiful. The third submachine gun, the 9mm Stein, is somewhat more interesting than the others. It's silenced and can be fired fully automatic while not making a sound, but the downside is that it needs to have considerable cooldown period after firing for only a short burst. Moving on to the rifles, the bolt-action Mauser is the first the player comes across. It starts off with nothing, but eventually the player acquires a scope to give it an added functionality for ranged combat, and serves its role adequately. The problem with the Mauser is that it's only serviceable for the early game, and is immediately outclassed by the weapon that shares the exact same ammo type. Easily the best weapon on the single-player side of Return to Castle Wolfenstein, in my opinion at least. The semi-automatic FG-42 begins with a scope, and due to its fast rate of fire, immediately outclasses the Mauser for mid to relatively long-range engagements, while also serving as an extremely powerful close-range weapon as well. To be fair to the Mauser, it does seem somewhat better than the FG-42 for truly long-range combat, but even this attribute is lacking when compared to the third rifle of the game, called the Snooper Rifle, which is silenced, has a night vision scope, and has the best accuracy of any gun in the player's arsenal. The player has 4 options to choose from when deciding between explosives. 2 different types of grenades which act nearly identical to one another, the dynamite which can be timed and placed, and the Panzerfaust rocket launcher which works as one would expect. The other 3 weapons are a tad more interesting, with the final 2 being the game's power weapons, so to speak. The flamethrower eats through its fuel supply quickly, but can do some pretty effective damage to groups of lesser enemies when you just hold down the left mouse and wiggle around for a bit. The Venom is the replacement for the Wolfenstein 3D chain gun, and like the Sten, it has a cooldown mechanic that keeps it from being fired indefinitely. It's obscenely powerful, and while needing to be reloaded, holds an absurd 500 rounds in the belt. Finally, the Tesla gun acts like the flamethrower to an extent, as you hold down the left mouse for an extended stream of attack, but unlike the flamethrower, the Tesla gun spews a stream of electricity that can attack multiple enemies at once by having the stream connect them with one another. And to top it all off, the player even gets a Duke Nukem style kick attack. The weapon variety in Return to Castle Wolfenstein is one of the game's strongest features, with each and every one of them being unique, satisfying to use, and useful throughout the playthrough. Even the Mauser, which I criticized previously, is a serviceable weapon at the end of the day. While the weapons may be solid, the enemy variety is less impressive. Not bad, mind you, just nothing to write home about. The game, of course, has a vast number of Nazi soldiers and officers, all of whom wield the weapons carried by the player. Some undead enemies that rely mostly on melee, tank-like super soldiers, and a couple of other strange ones on top of the bosses. While this is fine on the surface, there isn't much to differentiate the enemies from one another, with most simply being more powerful variants of one another and requiring similar strategy to dispose of. The vast majority of enemies are also hit-scan, which may be off-putting to certain players. The boss fights themselves are even less impressive, simply being superpowered bullet sponges that you just need to shoot until they die, which, in all fairness, is standard fare for the genre. While they may feel somewhat repetitive by what they bring to the table, the enemies do shine by being individually impactful. Like Wolfenstein 3D, even the lowest tier enemy can take off a substantial amount of health if one isn't paying attention or is playing carelessly, and groups of them can pose a genuine threat from beginning to end. While the game may not have many on screen at once, I think there's rarely an occasion where there's more than 6. The decision to make each individual opponent more imposing was an intelligent design choice. The quality over quantity approach to enemies and the threat they pose to the player might have been a result of Grey Matter Interactive's decision to bring back stealth elements to the Wolfenstein series after it was discarded from the Silas Warner games. The actual stealth mechanics in Return to Castle Wolfenstein are fairly basic. You crouch walk to avoid noise detection, enemies spot you with a fairly basic line of sight. If caught, you need to kill them before they can sound an alarm and alert most of their opponents in an area, and the game is tuned for lean so you can peek around corners for a better look at the situation. This is no Thief, but mixing these stealth mechanics together with the gunplay elevate the experience as a whole, and is one of the best mergings of the genre I can think of for its time. With exceptions of the segments that force players to fight or remain undetected, the player can freely choose between being stealthy and being a gunfighting extraordinaire. I tried both approaches on the 2 playthroughs I did for the review, my first going in mostly guns a-blazing, and the second playing it mostly safe, and found both to be valid solutions to enemy encounters and enjoyable to boot. Moving past the gunplay, stealth, and enemies, Return to Castle Wolfenstein has a number of other small design features to modernize it for its day, being a first-person shooter released after both the Quake games and Half-Life. You have basic jumps, a limited sprint function dictated by a stamina bar, reloading for the vast majority of weapons, and the aforementioned lean mechanic. The application of these features is mixed, to be frank. Reloading and lean are good features for the style of action game Return to Castle Wolfenstein is. The jump isn't all that helpful or detrimental either way beyond making goofing around a little easier, but the sprint implementation was an outright mistake. Having the sprint mechanic being limited to a stamina bar doesn't really add anything to the game. Having the maximum movement speed being limited is frustrating when running around larger maps and backtracking through them, and it begs the question, why not just have the sprint speed be the default movement speed? The levels are large enough to justify having such fast movement speed more often than they're not. Let's go into the level design, now that it's been mentioned. In contrast to the high praise I heaped on the gunplay and general action of Return to Castle Wolfenstein, the level design didn't fare quite as well. Now keep in mind, I don't think it's by any means bad. Come to think of it, I don't recall disliking any level of the game, which is a massive plus. But it's nothing that stands out, and it doesn't really hold a candle to some of its contemporaries. The levels are generally split between somewhat linear corridors and more wide open spaces, with the occasional level mixing the two together. The more linear levels don't require the player to backtrack or learn level layout, with some levels playing out just a straight path to the end. Which, again, that's not bad, it's just not exactly ideal. The larger levels fare a tad bit better on having more for the player to do, having enemy camps and sniper posts dotted around them, but despite being impressive for their day, they can feel too large and barren for their own good. There are absolutely particular standouts. The X-Labs, for instance, are a great series of combat encounters, and Paderborn Village towards the conclusion is probably the best stealth chapter in the game. But the overall collection isn't stellar. To round out the review, I should probably talk about the aspects of Return to Castle Wolfenstein that are not directly related to the gameplay, such as the visuals, soundtrack, and story. Although, to be fair, I'll point out how wildly unqualified I am for any objective judgments on sound design and animation fidelity. Good, good. The music is serviceable for a World War II action vehicle, but nothing in it really stood out to me personally. This is shocking when you consider the pedigree of id Software's past games in this aspect, with the Doom games having a notoriously catchy OST, and Quake 1 and 2 having bands compose their soundtracks, the Nine Inch Nails and Sonic Mayhem respectively. Especially for a game released in 2001, Return to Castle Wolfenstein looks very good and still holds up well in this retrospect. The large environments were impressive for their day, the art style is very nice, and the animations for the reloading and the other models are solid. The story for the game is far more of a focus than it was in any of the past Wolfenstein games, which may not sound like much, but features full voice acting, cinematic cutscenes placed before, after, and in between gameplay sections, and an overarching plot that ties everything together. Despite all of this added emphasis, the gameplay is still king, and the actual narrative doesn't take itself too seriously. From the Saxon zombie skeletons straight out of Army of Darkness, to the leather-clad Nazi women, and general tongue-in-cheek humor of the game, Grey Matter Interactive is clearly signaling to the audience just have fun with it. As goofy as it may be, the story of Return to Castle Wolfenstein has two notable elements which should be addressed. First off, this is the game that introduces Wilhelm Strauss, better known by the moniker Death's Head, as the main antagonist of the Wolfenstein series. He only appears as a side villain in this game, but he's the Nazi who receives the most play during the plot and would go on to be the villain in Wolfenstein 2009 and Wolfenstein The New Order. The second thing I've noted is the small semblance of characterization the game gives to silent protagonist BJ Blazkowicz. This is going to take a bit of explanation, I realize. At the end of the game, the OSA higher-ups in charge of BJ's missions throughout the game call it a job well done, and the British one of the pair asks what BJ is doing now that his adventure is done. The American counterpart tells his limey friend that he's, quote-unquote, off on a little R&R, and the scene jumps to Blazkowicz in combat gunning down some krauts. In context to the over-the-top Return to Castle Wolfenstein, this is just a gag to end the game on a lighter note. However, the idea that BJ is the kind of man who only feels at home in a gunfight and simply can't live a regular life outside of that may have been what inspired Machine Games and their voice depiction of the character in The New Order. I'll save my feelings towards that for the review of the 2014 release, but it's interesting to note how both the plot elements I've mentioned became core elements of the more narrative-heavy New Order. I may sound biased at the end of this, but even when including all of the issues that reared their head during this revisiting, I can safely say that Return to Castle Wolfenstein holds up very well. As an action game, it's easily one of the highlights of its day, and stood the test of time through clever design decisions and the sense that the game really was a passion project for those involved. Return to Castle Wolfenstein would go on to relative success, spawn a port for the Xbox, and a standalone multiplayer game Enemy Territory. It wouldn't be another 8 years, however, until we saw a proper sequel. Released in 2009, the oddly named Wolfenstein, the only Wolfenstein game christened with the series name alone, would attempt to bring the World War II franchise back into the modern market. Next time, we'll see how that fared.